Good morning, everyone. My name is Chuck McLean. I'm the Chief Public Utility Law Judge at the Maryland Public Service Commission. Today is January 11th, 2022. We're here in case number 9669. What's that? Right, yeah, I got it. 9669, which is the application of the Potomac Edison Company for a certificate of public convenience and necessity to rebuild the Doubs-Goose Creek 500 kV transmission line in Frederick and Montgomery counties, Maryland. It's good to see everyone in person for one of these hearings. So hope everyone had a good New Year and a good holiday. Why don't we start with appearances, ma'am?
Robin Leone, Your Honor, with Saul Ewing LLP on behalf of the Potomac Edison Company.
Good afternoon, ma'am, or good morning, ma'am. Mr. Tolson?
Good morning, Your Honor. Steve Tolson, Assistant Attorney General Counsel for the Power Plant Research Program of the Department of Natural Resources.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Your Honor. Michael Sammartino on behalf of the Maryland Office of People's Counsel.
Good morning.
Good morning, Your Honor. Michael Dean on behalf of the staff of the Maryland Public Service Commission. I would also like to enter the appearance of Catherine Macfarlane.
Okay, thank you, sir. Is that Moriarty?
Yes.
Is Mr. Alexander just here for fun?
No, Your Honor. I want to add, Mr. Alexander is also helping me. That'd be Gary Alexander on behalf of the Office of People's Counsel.
No
I
problem.
was waiting on him.
I'd also want to enter the appearance of my colleague, Greg Waterworth.
Good morning, sir. All right.
Judge McLean, if
Yes,
I
ma'am.
could just, Mr. Trout is unwell
okay.
this morning, and he may be joining us later, but would be sitting in the gallery if he's able to attend.
No problem. I hope he's feeling better. All right. All right. So before we get started, I just want to lay the ground rules. They'll be the same. Shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. We'll allow a witness to be called, cross-examined, and then a redirect, and then the questions will come up to me, and then I'll allow parties to ask questions based on mine. I'll obviously allow the company to have some live rejoinder if it wishes, as it has the burden of proof in this case. All right, do we have any questions before we get going? Anything preliminary?
I think from a preliminary standpoint, we did agree to anything that's been filed in the record. We are agreeing that it's not something that we need to bring a lot of copies and hand them out. And so we do have also witnesses that have been stipulated to. So if you'd like, the company could run down the list of exhibits that are, actually there's 3 that are already in the record, and then the additional ones that relate to the witnesses that will not be appearing, and then we can start with our first witness.
That would be fine, ma'am. In the third, we've got the certificate of compliance for the pre-hearing conference was number 1, correct? The second was the certificate of compliance for the first public hearing, and then did we admit the third one,
We did. I recall offering it. Yes.
Okay. All right.
So that would be the third.
Okay. To the extent that we didn't, or if we did, it'll be admitted. So, all right, Ms. Leone.
Our Exhibit 4 would be the application itself.
Okay.
Exhibit 5 would be the direct testimony of Kevin C. Irvine.
All right, that'll be so marked.
Exhibit 6 would be the supplemental direct testimony of Kevin C. Irvine.
Okay.
And Exhibit 7 would be the rebuttal testimony of Kevin C. Irvine.
All right, those are all marked as Ms. Leone requested.
And then there's a few more, Your Honor.
Oh, yeah.
Apologies.
No, it's okay. I didn't know if you were waiting for me.
The Exhibit 8 will be the direct testimony of Kelly M. Grube.
Okay.
The Exhibit 9 would be supplemental direct testimony of Ms. Grube.
Mm-hmm.
And Exhibit 10 would be her rebuttal testimony.
All right.
And then Exhibit 11 is the direct testimony of John J. Rostock, Jr.
Okay. Is that it, ma'am?
Yes.
All right. So those exhibits are marked and admitted, as the parties have already agreed to their stipulation. You want to start with your first witness, ma'am?
Or Mr. Waterworth will call the witness.
Good morning, Your Honor. I'd like to call Andrew Grant to the stand.
Okay. All right. Thank you, sir.
perjury. The statements made in this matter today are the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I do.
State your full name.
Andrew William Grant.
Spell your last name.
Grant.
Give me the business address.
800 Cabin Hill Drive, Greensburg, Pennsylvania.
Thank you very much. You can change it now.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very
Sir,
much.
before you get going, if anybody needs a break at any time, please just let me know. I tend to forget about time and I get rolling, and we can certainly stop for lunch if folks want to, but I definitely want to finish today. And I'm sure everybody would like to do that. I'm seeing some heads nod, so if we need to go a little bit later, we can do that. So, apologize.
Oh, thank you, Your Honor. And, Your Honor, if you'd like, or may I have permission to approach the witness?
Certainly.
That's a problem. You have to speak into a microphone, so get close to his mic for that one.
What- I think he's going to sit down after.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
My fault.
Mr. Grant, I handed you a binder there, and at tab 12 is a document that has been pre-marked as applicant's exhibit number 12, which is your direct testimony. Your Honor, this testimony was pre-filed in the case on August 3rd, 2021. Mr. Grant, was this testimony prepared by you or under supervision?
It was prepared by me.
Do you have any changes, additions, or deletions to your direct testimony?
No, sir, not at this time.
If I ask you the same questions today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, sir, they would be.
Do you adopt this testimony as your sworn testimony in this case?
Yes, sir, I do.
Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to move applicant's exhibit 12, which is Mr. Grant's direct testimony, into the record.
It'll be marked as Exhibit 12 for identification. Any objections?
No objections.
Hearing none, it's admitted.
And Your Honor, at this time, Mr. Grant is available for cross-examination.
Mr. Tolson?
I do not have any cross-examination.
Okay. Mr. San Martino?
Thank you, Your Honor. I do have a few questions for Mr. Grant. Good morning, Mr. Grant.
Good morning, sir.
On page 9 of your direct testimony, beginning at line 10, you state that the Doubs-Goose Creek line is very near the end of its service life, and that according to industry averages, the structures on this line are nearing or already past their expected end of life. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So I'm going to ask you a few questions more about your point that it's at near the end of its service life. And I have here the company's response to staff DR 2-9, which you sponsored. Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
You may.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
All right, let's mark this as OPC Exhibit 1 for identification.
Mr. Grant,
Yes, sir.
if you need a minute, just let me know.
Yeah, I'd like a minute to read over this or to finish reading over it. I appreciate it.
Sure thing. Just let me know when you're done.
Thank you, sir. Okay, sir, I've finished reading.
So, Mr. Grant, do you recognize what has been marked as OPC Exhibit 1? This is the DR.
Yes, sir, I do. I apologize.
And you sponsored the answer to this data response, correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Do you have any corrections to make to your response?
None at this time.
So your response remains accurate as of today's date, correct?
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, I would like to have OPC Exhibit 1 moved into evidence.
Okay. Any objections?
No objection.
All right, OPC 1's admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Grant, in this data response, the company addresses the criteria it uses to determine whether a line has reached its end of life. And you'd agree that age is not the only factor, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Now, turning back to your direct testimony at page 3, line 18, you describe the main drivers for condition-based projects. And you'd agree that this project is a condition-based project, correct?
Yes, I do.
And the condition of this line is driven by its age, correct?
Not necessarily.
Could you explain?
Yes, the condition of this line is driven mostly due to the type of material that was used to construct the weathering. It's weathering steel, the lattice structures that are present on this line. That more so than age, along with a few other factors in my direct testimony, are what make up the condition of this line, or what led to the condition of this line. Excuse me.
So in other words, Mr. Grant, you'd agree that it's the age-related, I guess, deterioration. Is it age-related deterioration or just deterioration of the line?
So it's kind of both. It's related to atmospheric conditions that are cumulative over time, thus leading to age, or leading us back to age. But it's not necessarily just because the line has been there for X number of years that this line needs to be replaced.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Now on page 7 of your direct testimony, beginning at line 3, you explain that the Doubs-Goose Creek line is unable to withstand maximum design loading parameters. Now, is it correct that maximum design loading parameters refers to the maximum load that a line is expected to experience during a particular event in its service life?
To the best of my knowledge, maximum design loading parameters are set by entities like the National Electric Safety Code, and they are specific to different regions of the country. As far as whether a line will see that type of loading in its lifespan, I can't predict that. But that is that they are based upon guidance from, again, the National Electric Safety Code.
When you say that you're unable to predict if these maximum design loading parameters may be experienced, then I'd be correct in saying you wouldn't know how frequently the structures on the Doubs-Goose Creek line have been subjected to these conditions, if they've been subjected to them at all?
Yes, I would say that's correct.
And to your knowledge, would I be correct in stating that Potomac Edison hasn't conducted any analysis on the probability of infrastructure failures occurring due to these maximum design loading parameters being experienced in the past or in the foreseeable future?
So, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking about analysis that the company has done to determine the, I'll call it the ability to withstand any of those loading parameters. Is that correct?
Partially, I guess. If I may clarify, I'm asking more about your opinion as to if the company has assessed the probability that the line may experience these conditions, if it's not retired, or if it's retired and remains standing for the next few years.
So, in terms of probability, I'm not aware of an analysis that was conducted as to the probability that one of these load cases would be experienced. But again, I would point back to the fact that these load cases are established by the National Electric Safety Code, and that is one of the governing entities for transmission line design.
Okay. Now, if you could turn to your direct testimony on page 9, beginning at line 10. And you state that the Doubs-Goose Creek line is very near the end of its service life. and the structures are nearing or already past the expected end of life. Then further down at line 19, you state that the Doubs-Goose Creek line will require a full rebuild in the near future, in parentheses, 2 to 4 years. Is it correct that this 2 to 4 year time frame reflects the time frame for the commencement of construction?
Yes, from the time that this testimony was filed.
Then would you agree that a delay in the commencement of constructions of up to 4 years would not pose an immediate reliability concern?
No, I can't say that with certainty, based upon the analysis that have been presented and that I've conducted myself. I stand behind what's in those lines you referenced.
So just to be clear, you're saying if the line requires a full rebuild in the near future in 2 to 4 years, and your prior statement is that 2 to 4 year window reflects the time when construction should begin. The statement that you just made here, you're saying that delay in the commencement of construction of up to 4 years, that would still pose a concern.
Can I object? I believe that mischaracterizes his testimony.
I would agree. I think he said he could not answer that question. So if you want to try again.
I'll ask a different question.
Yeah.
Mr. Grant, would you agree that after 5 years, any continued delay in addressing the line's condition would pose significant reliability concerns?
I would agree with the caveat that there are significant reliability concerns present on the line today, as demonstrated in the Quanta report and in my testimony.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Grant. Your Honor, I have no further
All right,
questions.
thank you. Mr. Dean?
Thank you, sir.
Staff has no questions for this witness. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Grant, just a couple quick questions. Can I direct your attention to page 7 of your testimony
Yes, sir.
on line 11? You were asked a few questions concerning tower modeling analysis on the line. Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
And can I direct your attention to line 11? Were tower modeling analysis done on this project?
Yes, sir, they were.
And what did they show?
In a nutshell, what they showed is that based upon the inspection results and how they were proportionally applied, and again, that was the inspection results were on a representative sampling of the structures, and that's detailed in a different part of my testimony. But essentially what it showed is that 91% of the existing structures comprising this line, most of those being weathering steel lattice construction, are unable to withstand the design loads. Maximum design loads, excuse me.
And what are the consequences of not being able to withstand the maximum design loading parameters?
So the main consequence of being unable to withstand a maximum design loading parameter would be structure failure, or I guess worst case scenario would be something that we refer to as a cascading failure, whereby say a light angle or a tangent structure fails, buckles in some way, and then that load is shifted, and that overstress is shifted and topples adjacent structures as well. So it's a cascading, sometimes also referred to as a domino failure. And that would lead to, of course, a long lead time for restoration, an interruption of service of this line, and a substantial cost as well.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. I have no questions, Mr. Grant. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Yeah, leave that there. Your Honor, we call David W. Souter with PJM.
Morning, sir.
Do you solemnly affirm that you will support the
I do.
Then you swear that
David William Souter,
tell me that, okay?
S-O-U-D-E-R,
And you will be satisfied.
2750 Monroe Avenue, Audubon, PA, 49403.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Souter, if you could take a look at the binder in front of you and turn to tab 13, please.
Yes,
We've pre-marked that document as applicant's exhibit number 13, which is your rebuttal testimony filed in this matter. Your Honor, this testimony was pre-filed on October 26, 2022. Mr. Souter, was this testimony prepared by you or under your supervision?
it was.
Do you have any changes, additions, or deletions to your rebuttal testimony?
I do not.
If I asked you the same questions today, would your answers be the same?
They would be.
Do you adopt this testimony as your sworn testimony in this case?
I do.
Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to move applicant's exhibit number 13, which is Mr. Souter's rebuttal testimony, into the record.
All right, we'll mark it as 13 for identification. Any objections?
No, Your Honor.
Hearing none, it's admitted.
And, Mr. Souter, could I turn your attention to tab 14?
Yes,
This is a document that's been pre-marked as applicant's 14, which is a errata sheet related to page 15, I believe, of your direct testimony. Is that correct? Or your rebuttal testimony, I'm sorry.
that is correct.
And Mr. Souter, is that, what was the purpose of filing that errata sheet?
It was correcting some of the accuracies of the TO zones in which the facility was in.
And when you say correcting some accuracies, can you be more specific? What?
Yeah, so we indicated that some of the facilities were in PEPCO when they were in Allegheny Power System.
And so those are the only changes on page 15 to your testimony, is that correct?
That's it.
Thank you. Your Honor, we would at this time move applicant's 14, which is an errata sheet replacing page 15 of his direct testimony.
All right, it'll be marked as 14 for identification. Any objections?
No objection.
Hearing none, it's admitted.
Your Honor, the witness is available for cross-examination.
Mr. Tolson.
No questions, Your Honor.
Mr. San Martino.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have a few questions for this witness. Good morning, Mr. Souter.
Good morning.
In your rebuttal testimony on page 4, beginning at line 10, you summarized the PJM RTEP process.
That's correct.
So the RTEP process, that refers to the Regional Transmission Expansion Plan, correct?
That's correct.
And this plan serves to ensure the electric grid remains reliable for customers, correct?
That's correct.
Now on page 5 of your rebuttal testimony, at lines 4 through 11, you identify 3 RTEP planning paths. There's the regional RTEP projects and sub-regional RTEP projects, supplemental projects, and customer-funded upgrades. Regional RTEP and sub-regional RTEP projects refer to baseline upgrades needed to address PGM criteria, correct?
That's correct.
And it is correct that PGM requires that regional RTEP and sub-regional RTEP projects be subjected to a competitive planning process. Is that correct?
There are exceptions to that process depending upon voltage, but in general, for this project, yes.
And in the competitive planning process, non-incumbent transmission developers have an opportunity to propose solutions to identified reliability problems, correct?
That's correct.
and PJM determines the winning bid based after its evaluation of the robustness and cost effectiveness of all the proposals that it receives, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Now, further down page 5 at lines 12 through 17, you identify the PJM criteria addressed through the regional RTEP and sub-regional RTEP. One of the criteria listed is individual transmission owner planning criteria as filed in the transmission owner's respective FERC form number 715. So I'd like to ask a couple questions about the FERC form number 715 criteria. And I have here a response to staff DR 9-3, which you sponsored. And this response discusses FERC form 715. Your Honor, may I approach the
You
witness?
may. Thank you. This will be OPC 2 for identification.
Let me know when you're ready to proceed, Mr. Souter. Okay, thank you. Mr. Souter, do you recognize what has been marked as OPC Exhibit 2?
I do.
And you sponsored the answer to staff DR 9-3, correct?
I did.
Do you have any corrections to make to your response?
I do not.
So your response remains accurate as of today's date, correct?
It does, yes.
Your Honor, I'd like to have OPC Exhibit 2 moved into evidence.
Any objections?
No objection.
All right, 2 is admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Souter, in your response to question 9-3A, you explain what a FERC Form 715 project is. Is it correct that FERC Form number 715 refers to a report transmission owners must file for system facilities rated greater than 100 kilovolts?
That's correct.
And it is correct that this report includes information about the conditions of each facility included in the report and the reliability criteria used to evaluate system performance. Is that correct?
It does not specifically include conditions on facilities, current facilities. It explains how they would approach an end-of-life project.
Okay.
And just to clarify that Dominion is the only transmission owner who's chosen to place 500 kV facilities into their 715 criteria, which is filed at FERC.
The only utility in this case, or just generally?
The only utility within the PJM service territory, and in this case. All other end-of-life criteria is within the supplemental attachment M3 process.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Souter. So now in your response to staff DR 9-3B, you state that Dominion's portion of the project was included in the RTEP as a Form number 715 project. And in your rebuttal testimony, on page 7, beginning at line 19, you explain that Dominion brought forward the Virginia segment of the Doubs-Goose Creek 500 kV line to PJM and submitted this proposal through PJM's 2020 RTEP proposal window. So just to clarify, when you state that Virginia is the only, Dominion's the only utility in the PJM region that has placed its criteria for 500 kilovolt lines within Form 715. Does that mean that are you stating that the company has delegated certain responsibilities to PJM for identifying whether a project has reached its end of life and should be included in the baseline RTEP?
No, the asset owner, the transmission owner, they determine when a facility reaches its end of life, and then they are governed by our governing agreements. In the case of the FERC 715 criteria, in Dominion 500 kV case, that would go through the PJM RTEP baseline approach, and that's only for their 500 kV and above. All other transmission owners, including Dominion for their facilities below 500 kV, go through the attachment M3 process, which is also filed at FERC. So the transmission owner, they have the expertise to determine when a facility is at its end of life. Once they determine a facility is at its end of life, then they approach PJM either through the attachment M3 supplemental approach or through the FERC Form 715 baseline approach.
Okay, thank you. And so just to clarify, so because the Virginia portion of the line was included in the RTEP as a FERC Form 715 project, it was subject to PJM's competitive planning process, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, Mr. Souter, on page 8 of your rebuttal testimony, beginning at line 3, and as you just testified, you explain the process, you refer to the attachment M3 process. And at this point in your rebuttal testimony, you explain that supplemental projects are those that are not required to satisfy PJM reliability, operational performance, economic, or FERC Form 715 criteria. So would you agree that, Mr. Souter, you'd agree that as a supplemental project, the Doubs-Goose Creek project is, by definition, not required to comply with the PJM criteria to address reliability needs, correct?
That is correct.
Now, you'd agree that there's a significant difference between the analysis and development of baseline projects and supplemental projects, correct?
I would not categorize it as significant.
Mr. Souter, and why is that?
Because there's still an analysis to determine what the impact would be on the system. When we go through a competitive window, we will take a look at all of our criteria, and which was defined, as part of our attachments within the TPL standard, as well as any of the PGM criteria, any requirements within the FERC Form 715. We perform that analysis on the case. In the example of a supplemental project, we would then model the changes to the facility. For instance, in this case, when they reconductor and rebuild the line, the ratings will go from 2,400 megawatts to 4,800 megawatts, which is a change in the characteristic of the line, which will change the flows on the system. So we will still do an analysis to make sure that the supplemental project, as it's built, does not cause any issues elsewhere on the system.
And so I guess the difference between the analysis that occurs or for a Form 715 project and a supplemental project, for a supplemental project, that analysis is largely driven by the entity that's proposing the project, and PJM's analysis is limited to a no harm analysis, correct?
It is called a do no harm analysis, but it takes a look at the PJM analysis as defined in the manual to make sure that there's no reliability issues elsewhere in the system.
And compared to PJM's analysis for a Form 715 project, for a supplemental project, PJM's not looking at various alternatives various alternatives that have been proposed to the identified transmission issue? Correct?
Now, as part of the supplemental project process, it's a 3 meeting approach with the TOs communicating their assumptions, their needs, and the solutions on separate meetings. And it allows for an open forum for other members to provide comments or ask questions or suggest solutions other than what is being proposed by the transmission owner.
But just to clarify, for a supplemental project, it's not subject to a competitive planning process.
It is not subject to a competitive planning process. However, it is an open process where stakeholders can provide comments or feedback.
And would you agree that an incumbent transmission owner could avoid having a project being subject to the competitive planning process by proposing it as a supplemental project rather than a FERC Form 715 project? Is that correct?
Well, the transmission owners are obligated to follow either the attachment M3 process or the FERC Form 715 process. It depends on, how they file end of life.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Souter. Your Honor, I have an exhibit to offer as well. Yes, Gary. Your Honor, may I have a minute to
You may.
talk with my counsel? Right. Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Souter, I have here the company's response to OPC DR 4-3. And this response discusses PJM's review process and analysis of supplemental projects. Your Honor, I'd like to have this DR marked as OPC Exhibit 3. May I approach the witness?
Please, yes, and there will be so marked. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Souter. Do you recognize what has been marked as OPC Exhibit 3?
I do.
And you sponsored the answer to this DR, correct?
I did.
Do you have any corrections to make to your response?
I do not.
So your response remains accurate as of today's date, correct?
It does.
Your Honor, I would like to have OPC Exhibit 3 moved into evidence.
Any objections?
No
No.
objection.
It's admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Souter, in response to question 4-3A, you explain PJM's review of supplemental projects. And as you previously testified today, you state that there's a three-part meeting process whereby PJM reviews the company's proposed supplemental project. Isn't it correct that the utility proposing the project is responsible for identifying the system need, presenting it to PJM, and proposing a solution for supplemental projects?
That is correct.
And is it correct that PJM's review and analysis is limited to what the utility presents to PJM and a do no harm analysis? Is that correct?
We analyze the solution that's proposed, correct.
So to clarify, the stakeholder input that occurs throughout the supplemental project process, PJM is not reviewing per se the solutions or the presented by various stakeholders. This analysis is limited to what the utility is presented and the results of its do no harm analysis.
So the utility would take the input from the stakeholders to determine if there is another approach that the transmission owner should take as part of other solutions that may be possible.
And in that circumstance, does the incumbent utility that's offering this proposed supplemental project, do they have the opportunity to review what the stakeholders have presented and revise their solution?
They do.
And to be clear, it is correct that this is not a competitive planning process.
It is not a competitive planning process, correct.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Souter. Your Honor, I have no further questions for this witness.
Mr. Dean?
Thank you. Staff has no questions for this witness. Thank you.
Ms. Leone?
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Souter, you were discussing the competitive process with respect to Dominion. What did the results of that process yield in the window?
There was no other solutions that were offered as part of that window other than what Dominion submitted as a replacement in kind based on end of life.
And replacement in kind is what Potomac Edison is proposing for the Maryland portion of the line, correct?
That is correct.
And there was some discussion about PJM's role with respect to the attachment M3 process, but in this case, isn't it correct that PJM performed an additional analysis beyond the do no harm analysis?
We did. At the request for this proceedings, we did do an analysis looking at the need for the Doubs-Goose Creek line by taking it out of a 2022 base case, which we augmented with another 500 kV immediate need project to make it the most current case, and that's the data that we provided as part of my testimony, as part of the reliability violations that would appear if this line was not rebuilt.
And could you just summarize, generally speaking, what the conclusion was?
Generally speaking, we are seeing, without the Doubs-Goose Creek line, we are seeing overloads on the 500 to 230 kV transformers at Dobbs, the 230 kV feeds from Dobbs to Dickerson, some of them approaching 130 to 140% of the emergency rating, which is outside of our established criteria. We're also seeing overloads in the Loudoun area along the 500 to 230 kV transformers, as well as a number of 230 kV facilities in the Dominion area. So a significant amount of overloads if this line were not to be rebuilt.
Thank you, Mr. Souter. I have no further questions.
Thank you, ma'am. Sir, just so I'm clear, an in-kind replacement, can you just...
Yeah, it would be basically rebuilding the same 500 kV lines from Dobbs to Goose Creek with, more current technology and better rated conductors.
And even though the Potomac Edison wants to increase the capacity, that's still considered in-kind?
That's in-kind, yes.
All right. Why is Dominion, this is more a curiosity than anything, why is Dominion the only utility in PJM that has kind of deferred its 500, okay, so
I don't
500
know.
kV
Honestly, I
rebuild
don't
to
know.
PJM?
That would be
Okay.
a Dominion question.
All right. All right, so it sounds like, so end-of-life projects are up to, the decision is up to the utility as to which path they pursue
Yes.
versus for Form 715 versus an M3 supplemental project.
Correct. So that the transmission owner will determine whether they want to go through the 715 route or the attachment M3. And like I indicated a majority of the transmission owners, including Dominion for the lower than 500 kV, have, approached the end-of-life process per the attachment M3.
And why is that, sir?
They have both of these processes are filed with FERC, and they have the ability to go with either route.
Okay. And is it fair to say that the 715 process is probably a little longer, takes longer of a process?
No, it's as you can see, both of these processes were accomplished throughout 2020. The supplemental process actually started in December of 19 and was complete by, let's say, October of 2020. The 715 process, open window process, started in June and was complete by December, so 6 to 8 months.
Okay. I mean, can you give an opinion as to why a utility would pick one way versus the other?
I don't know.
Okay, that's fair. One question I had on OPC Exhibit 3, sir, it's the data response you just talked about. It's in Part B on the second page, sir. It starts with, at the time Dominion brought forward. It's in the, about midway through the second paragraph, sir.
Yes, I see.
Okay, so essentially, it sounds like Dominion provided PJM modeling for the entire line, not just their 3-mile portion.
It would be it would be Dominion and First Energy working together.
Okay.
So they, when you string a conductor, they would use the same type of conductor and you don't want one portion of the line to be more limiting than another.
Sure. Okay. All right. Thank you very much, sir. Does anyone have any questions based on mine?
No, Your Honor.
I do, Your Honor.
Okay.
Mr. Souter, in response to Judge McLean's questions about the relative timeframes of the supplemental project and for Form 715 process, you state that the length of time for the process to carry out is generally around the same. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is there a difference in the robustness of the analysis with respect to alternatives to the projects proposed?
There is, no, I would say alternatives. We have an obligation to look from a baseline perspective, where we have an obligation to analyze all of alternatives that are put in through the window at the same consistently. So if there is, and no matter what solution comes through the supplemental process, whether it's the TO proposed solution or an augmented solution based on member feedback, we'd still analyze it to make sure it maintains the same level of reliability on the system.
So I'm a bit confused by your response. So when you state that PJM has an obligation to look at alternatives to the baseline issues that a project is proposed to address, correct?
We look at any of the proposals that come through the open window, correct?
And but that's specifically for a project that's included in the RTEP as a baseline reliability project, correct?
That is correct, yes.
And that's not the procedure that's applicable to a supplemental project. There's a different analysis that occurs for a supplemental project, correct?
From a supplemental project, we still look to make sure that the solution is reliable.
But PJM's analysis is not limited. PJM's analysis is limited only to that reliability analysis and not the viability, the robustness, and cost effectiveness of other alternative solutions, correct?
That's correct. We do not do a cost-effective review of it. It's what's provided to PJM, but we make sure that the solution's reliable and does not cause any reliability issues on the system.
Thank you, Mr. Souter. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Anyone else?
Just a quick follow-up on that, if you will, Your Honor.
Yes, ma'am.
Just to be clear, again, in this particular competitive window for Dominion in the form number 715 process as opposed to the attachment M3 process, there was just one solution offered. Do I have that right?
That is correct. You know, the Dobbs to Goose Creek line is a single line, and you could argue it actually went through both the supplemental process and the baseline process, and there has been no alternative solutions that were offered as part of the supplemental process, nor was there any kind of additional proposals other than the one that was offered by Dominion that came through the open window.
Thank you.
I'm sorry to keep beating the dead horse, but the Dominion is, they're the baseline part of the entire project is just the Dominion project.
Yeah, they're the 3 miles of the
Okay.
18 miles.
All right, that's all I wanted to make sure. All right. Thank you, sir. Appreciate your testimony.
Okay. Okay.
You're-
Yep. Oh,
If you could leave the, those extra, yeah,
Leave these up?
yeah,
Okay.
just in the event that they come up again. Thank you.
Your Honor, OPC requests just a few minutes for a bathroom break.
sure. Let's take 10 minutes and we'll come back at a couple minutes after 12.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. We're off the record.
Off the record, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, we're back on the record, Doug?
We're on the record.
All right. Ms. Leone?
We're going to call now Mr. Lawrence A. Hozempa to the stand,
Okay.
Your Honor.
You solemnly affirm under the penalties of perjury, these statements made in this matter today are the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I do. State your full name.
Lawrence A. Hozempa.
Spell your last name.
Hozempa.
Give me your business address, please.
76 South Main Street, Akron, Ohio.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Hozempa, if you take a look at the binder in front of you and turn to tab 15, please.
Okay.
That is a document that has been pre-marked as applicant's exhibit number 15, which is your direct testimony in this case. And Your Honor, this testimony was pre-filed on August 3rd, 2021. Mr. Hozempa, was this testimony prepared by you or under your supervision?
Yes, it was.
Do you have any changes, additions, or deletions to your direct testimony?
No, I do not.
If I asked you those same questions today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Do you adopt this testimony as your sworn testimony in this case?
Yes, I do.
Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to move applicant's exhibit number 15, which is Mr. Hozempa's direct testimony, into the record.
All right, it will be marked as 15 for identification. Any objections to its
No
admittance?
objections.
No objections.
All right, 15 is admitted.
And if you could take a look at tab 16, please. Behind tab 16 is a document that has been pre-marked as applicant's exhibit 16, which is your supplemental direct testimony filed in this case. Mr. Hozempa, was this testimony also prepared by you or under your supervision?
Yes, it was.
Do you have any changes, additions, or deletions to your supplemental testimony?
I do not.
If I asked you the same questions today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Do you adopt this testimony as your sworn testimony in this case?
Yes, I do.
Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to move applicant's exhibit number 16, which is Mr. Hozempa's supplemental direct testimony.
All right, it will be marked as 16 for identification. Any objections to its admittance?
No objections.
No.
Hearing none, it's admitted.
And finally, Mr. Hozempa, if you could turn to tab 17 in the binder. That is a document that has been pre-marked as applicant's exhibit number 17, which is your rebuttal testimony in this case, which was filed on October 26, 2022. Mr. Hozepa, was your rebuttal testimony prepared by you or under your supervision?
Yes, it was.
Do you have any changes, additions, or deletions to your rebuttal testimony?
I do not.
If I asked you the same questions today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Do you adopt this testimony as your sworn testimony in this case?
Yes, I do.
Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to move applicant's exhibit number 17, Mr. Hozempa's rebuttal testimony, into the record.
All right, we'll mark it as 17 for identification. Any objections to its admittance?
No
No,
objections.
Your
All right, 17 is admitted.
Your Honor, Mr. Hozempa is available for cross-examination.
Mr. Tolson.
No questions, Your Honor.
Mr. San Martino.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have a few questions for this witness. Good morning, Mr. Hozempa. I'll be asking some questions today about the company's consideration of alternatives and your testimony regarding the climate change factors and the planning process through which PGM reviewed this project. So if you could turn to page 8 of your direct testimony, beginning at line 15. You state that Potomac Edison supplemental projects are typically requests for service from new or existing customers or a project identified pursuant to First Energy's reliability enhancement methodology. And I can wait until you have it in front of you.
Sorry, I was having trouble with the binder.
All good.
Could you repeat the line reference, please?
Yes, it's page 8, beginning at line 15.
Okay, thank you.
And so, isn't it correct that, well, let me rephrase that. Is it correct that the Doubs-Goose Creek project was identified through First Energy's reliability enhancement methodology?
That is correct.
And Mr. Hozempa, have you reviewed the direct testimony of Mr. Sandeep Baidwan?
Yes, I have.
I'd like to ask about one of the company's DR responses that you sponsored that's attached to his testimony, and this would be DR 1-4. And I have, if I may approach, Your Honor?
You may.
Thank you.
Mr. San Martino, you said 1-4?
1-4, that's correct.
Okay, and it's already in, so all right, we don't have to.
Excuse me, Your Honor, I don't believe that testimony is admitted yet.
It's not, it is not. So why don't we just for the record, we'll mark this as a OPC exhibit just for identification. Do you need a copy of that, sir, or are you comfortable with the response?
I'm comfortable with the
Oh,
response.
okay, all right.
Your Honor, if it would help, I do have a copy of that.
Sure,
That I can
just-
hand to the witness,
okay,
just so that he
all right.
has it in front of him.
All right, so OPC 4 for identification will be exhibit 1 or data response 1-4.
Mr. Hozempa, you sponsored this DR, correct?
That is correct.
And the responses to this DR are still accurate as of today, correct?
Yes, there's actually 3 different responses to this DR.
I'm just asking about each response in the DR in total. It's correct.
Yes.
In this data response, one of the questions asks about whether Potomac Edison has conducted a power flow analysis. And the company responded that it had not. And now you're familiar with what a power flow analysis shows, correct?
Yes, I am.
And so you'd agree that a power flow analysis is essentially a reliability analysis of the transmission system that assesses if certain transmission elements are removed from service, correct?
That's part of it, yes.
And you'd agree that at the time the company submitted its application, it had not conducted a power flow analysis reflecting the impact of retiring or not rebuilding the line, correct?
That is correct.
So in other words, is it correct that Potomac Edison had not fully identified the reliability need for this project before identifying the project through the company's reliability enhancement methodology?
No, the reliability enhancement methodology was the methodology that we use to determine the need to rebuild the line. We have a condition section in that methodology document that identifies transmission assets that, based on certain criteria that are in that methodology, that would then identify them as candidates for being replaced. So whether it's transmission lines, transformers, or whatever the transmission asset may be. So that was the driver for the need to rebuild this line, came out of the methodology. As far as the reliability of the line, we do assessments of the system on a regular basis. We do annual assessments in conjunction with PJM. We do our own internal assessments for seasonal readiness. And we also work with Reliability First and do assessments with them as well. So there is a regular assessment of the reliability of the transmission system that's conducted throughout the year, every year, looking at various aspects of the transmission system. So in the model that we use, the Doubs-Goose Creek line is in service, and we test the system with that line in service. And so I can tell you sitting here today that that line is used and useful and provides reliability benefit, and I think the assessment that we did supplementing this response indicates that that line does provide reliability benefit.
But just to be clear, the assessment that you did to supplement your response to this DR, that assessment was done after after you had submitted your direct testimony, correct?
That is correct.
And if I may phrase my question another way, so when the company had determined, identified this project through the reliability enhancement methodology, it had not, you still had not fully addressed and evaluated the electrical need and the need to replace the capability that the line provides through a power flow analysis. Correct?
No, I would disagree with that because, as I stated previously, we do regular assessments of the transmission system that includes that line in the transmission system model. So we know, based on those analysis, that it is providing reliability benefit. All we did is supplement that initial response by doing a further analysis, modeling the line being retired to indicate the reliability benefit in more detail that it provides.
But that further analysis was not done at the time that the application was submitted, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. Now, on page 5 of your rebuttal testimony, beginning at line 7, in response to a question about the company identifying and assessing viable alternative solutions, you state that the company has not assessed or identified any viable reinforcements to address the identified reliability criteria violations. Now, in this context, am I correct to understand reinforcements to mean alternatives, or is there a difference?
Well, what this question is basically stating is once we did the modeling of the transmission system with the Doubs-Goose Creek line out of service and saw the different violations that occurred on the transmission elements, as Mr. Souter stated previously, the different elements that they saw overloaded. We, as Potomac Edison, did not identify what upgrades would be necessary to address those specific violations we identified in the subsequent analysis.
Now, in your role with the company, Mr. Hozempa, you're responsible for overseeing the transmission planning function for First Energy transmission subsidiaries, including Potomac Edison, correct?
That is correct.
And this responsibility includes evaluating and selecting solutions for identified transmission needs, correct?
That is correct.
And the review of these proposed solutions entails evaluating cost benefits and the robustness of alternatives that could satisfy an identified transmission need, correct?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question?
Sure. So you review, in your review of solutions to identified transmission needs, are you evaluating the various cost benefits and the robustness of alternatives that could satisfy an identified transmission need?
Well, needs are different than solutions. So when it comes to needs, those just rise up based on system conditions. And if, for example, if a new customer is connecting to the system, and because of that new customer, we identify that now there's voltage issues or thermal loading issues on various transmission elements, that is the need. That doesn't necessarily dictate the solution. So the need doesn't have a cost-benefit need. That doesn't make sense. So solutions we look at from that perspective, but needs we do not. Needs just appear.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification. And so, so it's correct then that the company's you're evaluating the costs and benefits and robustness of various alternatives for the solutions that the company has identified.
That is correct.
Okay. On page 5 at line 10 of your rebuttal testimony, you state that additional infrastructure upgrades would be needed beyond the rebuild if the line was not replaced. However, elsewhere in your direct supplemental or rebuttal testimonies, there's no discussion of whether the company has weighed the costs of these infrastructure upgrades against the cost of completely rebuilding the line. Is it correct that the company didn't conduct an analysis of this?
Well, no, as stated up a few lines above that, we did not identify what would be necessary to address the identified violations that we identified during the supplemental assessment where we took the line out of service as if it was retired and ran that initial review with that. Some of those facilities that are overloaded are not owned by Potomac Edison. So what the solution may be for the Dominion facilities or the Pepco facilities, I couldn't even tell you what their recommended solutions would be, and it would be up to them to determine the cost of what it would take to upgrade their facilities. We have no influence on what they choose to do for those violations on their elements. We can control what we do within our own system, but outside of our system, we have no control. So we could look at all those violations we identified and say, well, hey, here's the ones that Potomac Edison could do, and here's this cost. But these other ones that are outside of our transmission zone, we have no idea what the solutions may be or what the transmission owner may elect to do.
Okay, and just to be clear, for the violations you identified in Potomac Edison's transmission zone, the company didn't look at the costs of the remedies for those violations.
That is correct.
Okay. At the bottom of page 5, still in your rebuttal testimony, beginning at line 21, you state that the company has not compared the economic or other benefits of alternative solutions to address reliability criteria violations that the company has identified in the confidential exhibit that was attached to your rebuttal testimony. But on page 12, beginning at line 8 of your direct testimony, you state that the company ruled out greenfield transmission line alternatives primarily due to cost. Now, is it correct that a greenfield transmission line refers to a line constructed along a new route outside of an existing ROW, correct?
That is correct.
And you'd agree that compared to building within an existing ROW, greenfield transmission lines are generally more expensive, mainly due to the cost of purchasing and clearing new rights of way and incurring additional legal and permitting cost. Is that correct?
Those would be some of the factors that would go into permitting a new line, yes.
So with respect to the Doubs-Goose Creek line, you'd agree that the only alternatives whose costs were considered were more expensive greenfield transmission alternatives, correct?
That is correct.
And you'd also agree that the company did not evaluate the costs of other non-greenfield transmission alternatives, correct?
Well, I would say not that we didn't consider them, we didn't identify any that would be viable solutions to rebuilding the line.
And just to follow up on that, would it be correct that the company didn't fully evaluate these alternatives? How did the company determine that these alternatives were non-viable?
Well, because the capacity of a 500 kV line is hard to duplicate with lower voltage facilities. It becomes more difficult to get that same transfer capability and reliability capability with lower voltage facilities. So to add additional infrastructure to lower voltage facilities to accomplish the same goal would take additional lower voltage facilities than just rebuilding this line.
So would you agree that while these alternatives, are these alternatives that you're suggesting, are they physically viable but maybe not cost effective? Or I'm a little confused as your discussion of what you mean by viability and how you determine whether something is viable or not without fully evaluating what that solution is and the cost benefits of that solution.
And that's a very good question, and I'll explain it this way. We have been in permitting proceedings before for transmission lines that have been denied, and we have had to come up with lower voltage solutions to address those issues. So one particular case I can think of is the transmission line would have been 10 miles of new greenfield transmission line. It was about $110 million to build that line. So because the line was denied, we had to come up with an alternative solution at the request of the authority, which we did develop one. It actually includes about 60 miles of lower voltage facilities at a cost of pretty close to $300 million. So is it physically possible? Yes, but to impact 60 miles of line versus 10, those kind of things are what we consider. So from a cost-effective and environmental minimization perspective, the 500 kV line certainly makes sense compared to numerous lower voltage facilities to accomplish the same reliability target.
But just to be clear, Mr. Hozempa, the company didn't fully assess and consider that sort of alternative solution to rebuilding the Doubs-Goose Creek line. Is that correct?
That is correct. And again, in this case, because we're interfacing with Dominion, whatever solution that we would develop, Dominion would have to be amenable to that. In other words, they would have to accept our proposal and do something similar. Because if they build a 500 kV line that goes to the state line and stops there, and we have something different on the Potomac Edison side of the river, and they're not compatible, well, then we really haven't accomplished the need to create that connection between the Doubs substation and the Goose Creek substation. And in addition, with the analysis as we've shown, there's reliability violations on the Pepco facilities also. And so they would have to be involved, most likely be involved in whatever other solution we came up with that was not the solution we're proposing here today. Now, Dominion identified, that 500 kV alternative is the best solution for them, and the Virginia State Corporation Commission agreed with them.
So I'd like to ask a little bit more about how the Dominion project affects the company's evaluation of alternatives. And I believe in your rebuttal testimony on page 10, beginning at line 4, in reference to the company's, a question about the company's consideration of non-wires alternatives, you address how the Virginia portion factors in. So when you say compatibility, are you referring to a situation where it's physically impossible for Potomac Edison, for a solution that Potomac Edison has proposed to connect to the Virginia line?
I guess I'm not sure what you mean by physically impossible, because there's all sorts of electrical equipment out there that can make a connection between two different entities viable. And if you look at the western interconnect compared to the eastern interconnect, there's back-to-back DC ties, asynchronous ties. So those two systems are tied together through those DC interfaces, even though they're not connected solidly together through the AC ties. So is there options? Yes, there's options. They become very expensive options, but they're options.
And you'd agree that, assuming that, these options exist and could be applicable in this circumstance, you'd agree that Dominion would be unable to prohibit Potomac Edison from implementing that solution. As long as it can connect to the line, Dominion would be unable to prohibit Potomac Edison from pursuing that course of action. Correct?
I would say if it met all the reliability needs that the proposed project does, I would say they would not be able to dictate what Potomac Edison could do. But if it didn't meet the need of the system, either Dominion or PJM could say that that's not an acceptable solution.
And earlier, you referenced the approval of this project by the Virginia State Corporation Commission. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you'd agree that the Virginia State Corporation Commission's approval of Dominion's project wouldn't preclude Potomac Edison from constructing its own non-wired project, correct? Assuming that the non-wired alternative would be compatible with the Virginia portion of the line and meet the line's needs.
Well, I guess in my mind, I cannot see a non-wire solution where there's no line between, like, say, Doubs and the Potomac River. I do not see that being an acceptable alternative, because I don't know how that would work. So if Dominion builds their 500 kV line to the Potomac River, and Potomac Edison doesn't have anything on the other side, I'm not sure how that can be an acceptable solution.
But would you agree that there's the company could pursue a hybrid solution? Or there's a number of I don't want to get into any hypotheticals about this. I think that would belabor the point. But But just to be clear, you're stating that while a non-wires alternative in this circumstance may, well, in fact, and after analysis and investigation, not be a viable and feasible option, it would still, the company would not be prohibited from investigating that and evaluating it simply due to the fact that Dominion chose the line, chose to build a wired solution for the identified need of that line.
Well, straying into the hypothetical, because I think we have to at this point based on the question. Okay, so we stray into the hypothetical and say, could there be a non-wires alternative that would meet this need? In my opinion, no, because a number of reasons is one, I don't think you could build one large enough to accomplish the need. I just don't think that's reasonable, and I don't think it would be cost effective. So that's my professional opinion. The other issue I have is many of those solutions that would have to be constructed to be a clear non-wires alternative and accomplish the same thing that this 500 kV line does, you'd be crossing over into the market side of the PJM process. And we're prohibited from competing in the market. So we could not do a lot of those things that are non-wires alternatives. We could put in voltage support devices, STATCOMs, SVCs, synchronous condensers, all sorts of things that enhance the reliability of the transmission system that are transmission solutions, but we cannot propose market solutions.
And Mr. Hosepa, so am I correct to understand that the term market-based, as you're using it here, that's referring to a participant in an energy market? So in other words, a consumer of energy or a generator of energy, correct?
Yes, or the ancillary service market too, which would also be part of that.
And in your professional opinion, are there non-wires alternatives that can be configured to avoid being treated as a market participant?
Can I object? I think he actually just listed them, but
I'll overrule it. I'll let you answer, sir, if you know.
I'm not certain. I believe there may be some things that could be adjusted to make sure that a device that would typically be competing in the market is configured that it can only be a transmission reliability solution. I'm not sure quite how that would work, but I suppose that there'd be some way that you could do that.
Thank you, Mr. Hosempa. I have here the company's response to staff DR 8-4, which you sponsored. And Your Honor, the label on this was part of a confidential data request that staff sent to the company. And I have talked both with counsel for the company and counsel with staff, and my understanding is that the information in the data response is non-confidential. So I would like to be able to offer it into the record.
Sure, as long as the company's comfortable that it's
to clarify,
no longer.
Yeah, to clarify, Your Honor, the request came to us marked confidential.
Okay.
And so when we responded, we kept the confidentiality designation, but the response does not
Okay, great.
include business confidential
All right.
information.
And to the extent we have any confidential cross for any witnesses, we'll plan on running through all the public questions first, and then we'll do the confidential afterwards, so we don't have to jump in and out of confidential session.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I approach the witness?
You may. Thank you. Thank you. So we'll mark this as OPC Exhibit 5 for identification, and it is not confidential.
Mr. Hozempa, do you recognize what has been marked as OPC Exhibit 5?
Yes, I do.
And you sponsored the answer to this DR, correct?
That is correct.
Do you have any corrections to make to your response?
I do not.
So your response remains accurate as of today's date, correct?
That is correct.
Your Honor, I'd like to have OPC Exhibit 5 moved into evidence.
Any objections?
No objection.
5 is admitted.
Mr. Hozempa, in your response to question 8-4B, the company identifies several examples of non-wires alternatives which could supplant the rebuild of existing transmission facilities. And as you state in the DR response, these examples are STATCOM, SVC, and fax devices. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And is it correct that STATCOM refers to a static synchronous compensator?
Yes.
And is it correct that this device functions to regulate the voltage at the point of connection to a power grid?
Yes.
And is it also correct that this device could be deployed to boost the capacity of an existing line?
Yes, but let me qualify my yes. Because, again, a STATCOM provides reactive power, not real power. So, if a transmission line capacity was limited due to the amount of reactive power flowing on that transmission line, then a STATCOM would be beneficial because it would provide that reactive power at the point of use rather than the transmission line having to provide that reactive power.
Thank you. And Mr. Hozempa, is it correct that your reference to SVC refers to a static VAR compensator?
Yes.
And is it correct that, similar to STATCOM, this device can also be used to regulate the voltage of an existing line to improve that line's efficiency and carrying capacity?
Yes, with the same restrictions. If it's a reactive power issue, then a reactive power device would help.
And is it correct that FACS refers to flexible AC transmission system?
Yes.
And is it correct that FACS, that this system is comprised of power electronics components that can enhance controllability and increase the power transfer capability of the transmission network?
Yes.
And Mr. Hozempa, you'd agree that each of these examples of NWAs that you provided in your response to 8-4B are not market-based solutions, correct?
That is correct.
And with respect to STATCOM and SVC, these would be able to, these, as you stated, and I just want to be clear, these provide reactive power. So this could provide, I think what you refer to in your testimony as MVAR.
Yes, that is correct.
And is it also correct that the company did not evaluate how these technologies could be incorporated into a potential alternative solution for the proposed Doubs-Goose Creek line?
We did not, and the reason being that this is a real power issue. Megawatts, not megavars. So it's the delivery of megawatts, the delivery of real power that's the question here.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Hozempa, actually, give me one second here. Mr. Hozempa, I have here the company's response to staff DR 6-3, which you also sponsored. Your Honor, I'd like to have this DR marked as OPC Exhibit 6.
All right, it'll be 6 for identification.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may. Thank you.
Mr. Hozempa, do you recognize what has been marked as OPC Exhibit 6?
Yes, I do.
And you sponsored the answer to this DR, correct?
That is correct.
Do you have any corrections to make to your response?
I do not.
So your response remains accurate as of today's date, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Your Honor, I'd like to have OPC Exhibit 6 moved into evidence.
Any objections?
No objections.
It's admitted.
Mr. Hozempa, the company states in its response to 6-3A that NWAs will have to provide real power, and real power is a market-based resource. Is it your professional opinion that real power in all circumstances is a market-based resource?
Yes, because we are a transmission company. So the generation part of the electric market is all, of the electric system is all market-based. We don't provide megawatts to anybody. On our own, we don't create megawatts. We just deliver the megawatts from whoever's supplying them to whoever needs them. We just deliver them.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hozempa. Now, on page 11 of your testimony, beginning at line 15, you discuss the alternatives to rebuild the project considered by Potomac Edison.
Just to clarify, page 11 of my direct testimony.
I believe so.
Okay.
Yes, I apologize. That's correct. Now, Mr. Hozempa, I have the company's response to OPC DR3-2, which you sponsored, and this asks questions about the company's analysis of alternatives. Your Honor, I would like to have this exhibit marked as OPC 7.
It'll be so marked for identification.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may. Thanks.
Mr. Hozempa, do you recognize what has been marked as OPC Exhibit 7?
Yes, I do.
And you sponsored the answer to OPC DR3-2, correct?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any corrections to make to your response?
No,
So your response remains accurate as of today's date, correct?
that is correct.
Your Honor, I'd like to have OPC Exhibit 7 moved into evidence.
Any objections?
No objection.
All right, 7 is admitted.
Now, Mr. Hozempa, question 3-2A in this DR asks about whether the company evaluated alternative transmission paths. And the company's response objects to OPC's DR on grounds that this project is a modification of existing transmission facilities for which analysis of alternative routes is not required. So is it correct that you'd agree that if this project were considered new construction, the company would be required to evaluate alternatives?
Objection. He's not an attorney, Your Honor.
It's a modification. Everybody agrees it's a modification.
Your Honor, if what I'm asking about is the witnesses stating that it's a modification. I'm asking about the witness's personal knowledge or opinion about what would happen if it was considered new construction.
Are you talking about if one of these options in the data response were pursued, whether or not that would be considered new construction? Is that your question?
Not entirely, Your Honor.
Why don't you try it again?
Okay. Mr. Hozempa, would I be correct in understanding that if a project is characterized as a modification, then the company's alternative analysis would be more limited than that of a new line? Is that correct?
Same objection.
That's overruled, if you know, sir.
Actually, I do not. I'm an engineer by trade, and whenever I have questions about the need for permitting, I go to our legal staff for that guidance so they can tell me what needs to be done or doesn't need to be done. So I do not have that knowledge.
Well, in your personal opinion as an engineer, would you agree that when you reviewed this project and saw that this is a rebuild of an existing line, your understanding is that the scope of work entails installing new structures, new conductor bundles, and new wires, correct?
That is correct.
And so from your perspective as a transmission planner, you'd agree that this scope of work more closely resembles the construction of a new line than, say, reconductoring or replacement of certain problematic structures on an existing line, correct?
No, I would disagree with that. The amount of work to rebuild this line is similar to building a new line. Yes, I do agree with that, but when you're building a new greenfield line, you're out there acquiring property, negotiating with property owners, clearing rights of way, going through the permitting process, talking to all the environmental agencies that could be involved in. It can become quite significantly more effort than to rebuild lines on existing rights of way. And we do this across our service territory on a regular basis. Looking at the electric utility industry, 100 years we've been in service, and the facilities we have out there, it's no surprise to anybody, they're starting to age and they need rebuilt. So we've been rebuilding transmission lines across our system on an as-needed basis to make sure that we can continue to maintain the reliability that we have today.
So then is it correct that, in your opinion, every in-kind replacement of a transmission line within Potomac Edison service territory is a modification of an existing line?
I would say yes.
Okay. Mr. Hozempa, in your rebuttal testimony on page 6, beginning at line 12, you disagree with the opinion expressed by Mr. Sandeep Baidwan that the company should reevaluate transmission line in light of the specific need that the line was originally constructed to address. And is it correct that, in your view, the original purpose of a line is irrelevant?
Yes.
Beginning at line 15 of your rebuttal testimony, on the same page, you provide an analogy to explain how the need that a transmission line serves may change over time. Is it your opinion that the initial need for the Doubs-Goose Creek line was that it was constructed to serve has evolved and changed over time since the line's construction?
Yes. Going back to when this line was constructed and the way the system was developing at that time in the 60s and early 70s, kind of the beginning of the EHV system at that time on the eastern seaboard. The EHV system was developed to deliver energy from remote generation to load pockets. There wasn't a lot of generation being built at the time, and load was increasing, so this was a way to make the system operate more efficiently. Since that time, again, we're going back to the late 60s, early 70s. I think in this case, 1966, the line was actually constructed. So there's been more generation built. Generation has deactivated. Load pockets have changed. Where they were before, they aren't necessarily the same today, as industries have changed over time, particularly in the Potomac Edison region as well. The load, like the East Elko facility, is not there anymore. That aluminum smelting plant doesn't exist. So, but loads have been replaced by other loads as well. And so we continue to have this need as the system evolves, and that's why we do our continual analysis. I mean, we review the system for reliability on a regular basis. With PJM, with reliability first, and internally to make sure the system can maintain the reliability we have today. So as things change on the system, as generation is added, as generation retires, as loads change on the system, we can make sure the system operates reliably. So when this line was built to deliver generation from a remote resource into the Northern Virginia load pocket, that might have been the original driver. Is it still serving that purpose today? I would say yes, it's still delivering load. But now the generation fleet has changed, and is it from the same generators to that load pocket? I can't say that's true, and I'm not sure that's relevant.
So you'd agree then that the need for the Doubs-Goose Creek line, the need that it serves currently, it may continue to evolve and change over the course of future years.
Well, yes, I do, and I think it's obvious. Just last year, PGM was working with Dominion because of the data center load growth in Northern Virginia, where they identified infrastructure needs in Northern Virginia to serve the data center load because of the significant load growth they're seeing. So those kinds of things do happen on the transmission system that then require additional reinforcements and upgrades to the transmission system. In this case, a several $100 million project in the Dominion footprint to reliably serve that load. So yes, things are going to change. That's what we do is planning. We try to forecast the future, looking out into the future, determine what the loads are going to be, what the generation resources are going to be, and we build models around that to simulate that. Then we test the system to make sure that when we get to that future year, whatever that year may be, that the system's going to be reliable.
And in this analytical process that you just described, is it through that process by which the company determines whether an existing line should be reconductored or completely replaced, or whether a new line ought to be built?
Yes, but I'd like to explain a little further. So, from the planning perspective, as I always tell the engineers that actually do the design work, our world is flat and our world is straight. So whenever we have a project to propose, it's easy for us to model those things because we say for a transmission line, if we identify a need for a new transmission line, it's easy for us to model that. We pick the starting point, the ending point, we build it into the model, and then we run with that. Now, if we think that is the best project and then it moves forward, then the engineering teams get involved and they tell us all the things that we planned incorrectly because we were taking it through a place where, for example, you can't build a line. So we have to come up with alternative solutions as we work through the process. But in general, for example, like a reconductoring project, if there's an existing transmission line and transmission planning does its analysis and says that conductor is too small, we need larger conductor on those structures. We would propose that, let the engineering team look at it, and when they would look at that, they would say, well, those structures are no longer strong enough to support that larger conductor. So here's some alternatives. Use a different conductor, for example, a high temperature, low sag conductor, so you don't add additional physical stress to the towers, or you rebuild the entire line with stronger towers and a bigger conductor. So there's all kind of things that go into the planning analysis. We come up with the solutions. We refine those through the engineering efforts to determine what is the right solution.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hozempa. Now I'd like to ask a few questions about your supplemental direct testimony. And on page 1, beginning at line 17 and continuing on to page 2, you acknowledge 2 new statutory factors regarding climate change that the Commission is now required to consider. And these factors are the preservation of environmental quality, including protection of the global climate from continued short-term and long-term warming, and achievement of the state's climate commitments for reducing statewide greenhouse gas emissions.
Bless you.
Based on your testimony, is it correct that you've reviewed these factors and you're familiar with them?
I'm familiar. Yes, I have reviewed those. I have not reviewed those in any great detail that I've become an expert on those by any stretch of the imagination. I do have an understanding of what the intent was, though.
And you'd agree that the company's application ought to include enough information that's specific to the project that the commission to allow the commission to sufficiently consider those factors, correct?
Yes.
Now, concerning the first factor, the preservation of environmental quality, on page 3 of your supplemental testimony, beginning at line 4, you state that the Doubs-Goose Creek project will help preserve environmental quality and global climate by facilitating the deliverability of renewable generation resources. And on the second factor, on page 5 of your supplemental testimony, beginning at line 13, you state that because the additional capacity provided by the Doubs-Goose Creek line will facilitate deliverability of renewable resources, this would help achieve the state's climate commitments. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Now, Mr. Hozempa, I'd like to ask about the company's response to OPC DR 1-5. This response is appended to Mr. Sandeep Baidwan's direct testimony. Your Honor, would you like me to offer that into evidence?
We can just mark it,
Okay.
since it's going to be coming in anyway. You said 1-5, sir?
1-5, that's correct.
All right. Did you have a copy of that, sir, or Ms.?
I do not have a copy.
Okay. Do you happen to have an extra copy for the witness?
I can provide a copy to
Okay,
the witness,
thank you.
yes.
This will be OPC 8 for identification. Thanks.
Mr. Hozempa, do you recognize these responses?
Yes, I do.
And I take it you prepared the company's responses to this DR, correct?
Yes, I did.
And do these answers remain accurate as of today?
Yes.
In your response to question 1-5D, the company states that it has no information related to the anticipated load growth of renewable generation or distributed energy resources within the Eastern Interconnection over the next 10 years. Is it correct that the company did not conduct any studies or evaluate the anticipated load growth of renewable resources directly related to rebuilding this line?
We did not do any evaluation of generation resources of any kind in relation to the rebuild of this line.
And in the response to question 1-5E, where the company states that it's unaware of any specific project that could benefit from the additional capacity provided by the higher line rating. So is it correct that the company did not evaluate the effect of the line's additional capacity would have on renewable generation interconnections?
That is correct.
In the response to question 1-5G, the company states that it has not conducted any analysis to determine how much incremental renewable or clean energy generation, interconnection, or integration could be facilitated by rebuilding the line with the higher rating. Is it correct that the company did not conduct any studies specific to the Doubs-Goose Creek line to assess the line's direct impact on the development of renewable generation resources in the region?
That is correct, but just to be clear, the interconnection process at PJM is managed by PJM when it comes to all generation resources. That's not something that First Energy or Potomac Edison does on its own. We work in conjunction with PJM for the generation interconnection studies. So we did not do any independent analysis on the change in capacity for this transmission upgrade to find out what that would facilitate, and that will be done eventually through the PJM process.
Now, in your response to question 1-5A, the company states that, in general, any renewable generation or distributed energy resource connected within the Eastern Connection is served by the Doubs-Goose Creek 500 kV line. Is it also correct that any fossil fuel generation resource connected within the Eastern Interconnection is also served by the Doubs-Goose Creek 500 kV line?
Yes, that is correct. And again, because of the way the system is constructed. So, and I'm sure you've heard this before, that the Eastern Interconnect is the largest machine in the world. Right, so in that machine, you have generating resources of all types. Then you have transmission lines that connect all those generating resources to loads within that same interconnection. So the generation feeds into the system and the load draws off of the system. So any particular load is getting the generation that's in the system. Whether that generation is fossil fuel or whether that generation is renewable. So when it comes right down to it, in a simplified version, electrons are electrons. They go where they go.
So, just so I'm clear, the company, in stating that this line will help contribute towards achievement of Maryland's greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals and the preservation of the global climate, the company didn't conduct any studies or analysis specific to the project about how the project contributes to meeting those factors, correct?
We did not, but we did rely on, and it's in my, I think it's in my rebuttal testimony.
Maybe bottom of 10, top of 11, sir, perhaps.
Yeah, that's one part. I'm
Okay.
sorry, it must be in my
All right.
supplemental direct is what I'm looking for. We did not do any studies on our own, but on page 3 of my supplemental direct testimony, kind of beginning on response to the question beginning on page 3 at the top, and then goes on from line 10 basically to page 4, line 11. There's other people that have done studies about the transmission system and the ability to deliver renewable generation, and these are people that are focused on achieving low carbon or zero carbon future for the nation. So they do these types of studies on a regular basis with a focus on that specific aspect of studying and figuring out how do we get enough infrastructure in place to achieve that goal. And one of the things that they have determined is that additional transmission capacity is necessary to make sure that we can achieve a low carbon or zero carbon future. And so by adding additional capacity to this transmission line, we are working toward that goal. And thank you, Your Honor, for the reference of my rebuttal testimony. And on line 10, or page 10, and going on to page 11, the question about the integration of renewable generation, and this is public information, so it's easy for anybody to find. If you go and look at the PJM interconnection queue, you can see that in the Dominion footprint, or in Virginia, there's over 50,000 megawatts of renewable resources in the generation queue. And in Maryland, there's 5,000. So there's 10 times more in Dominion. Now, it's unlikely that all of that will go into service, but some percentage of those will. And let's say that it's 50%, just to use a number. So in Maryland, you get 2,600 megawatts, but then in Virginia, you get 25,000 megawatts. So where's that generation in Virginia going to go if you only have 2,500 megawatts of generation in Virginia, but in Maryland, but 25,000 megawatts in Virginia? That generation is going to flow from Virginia into Maryland.
And is it correct, Mr. Hozempa, that the company doesn't know how many projects in the interconnection queue will be realized if the line is built?
Yes, that is correct. We do not have that knowledge.
So to ask a little bit more about your discussion of the possibility of renewable energy from Virginia being transmitted into Maryland, isn't it correct that the company does not know whether rebuilding the Doubs-Goose Creek 500 kV line will have any effect on whether those renewable generation resources in in Virginia will be interconnected or brought online?
That is correct.
Now, Mr. Hozempa, I have here the company's response to OPC DR 1-8, which you sponsored. Your Honor, I'd like to have this DR marked as OPC Exhibit 9.
It'll be marked for identification.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
Mr. Hozempa, do you recognize what has been marked as OPC Exhibit 9?
Yes.
And you sponsored the answer to this DR, correct?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any corrections to make to your response?
I do not.
So your response remains accurate as of today's date, correct?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd like to have OPC Exhibit 9 moved into evidence.
All right, any objections?
No objection.
All right, nine's admitted.
Mr. Hozempa, in this DR, the company states that it has not performed any analysis of load growth over the next 10 years attributable to EV interconnections within the geographic area served by the Doubs-Goose Creek 500 kV line. And in your supplemental direct testimony on page 5, you state that the additional capacity that this line provides will help achieve the state's efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through electric vehicle use.
page reference again?
The page reference was the supplemental direct testimony, page 5, beginning at line 19.
Thank you.
So is it also correct that the company performed no load growth calculations attributable to increasing electric vehicle use over any period of time?
We did not do any analysis in relation to this specific project. We have done some high-level analyses throughout the First Energy footprint on the impact of electrification as well as electrical vehicles.
But to clarify, specific to this project, it's correct that the company has conducted no analysis of its impact on electric vehicle interconnections, correct?
That is correct.
So I'd be correct then in stating that the company has performed no analysis specific to the Doubs-Goose Creek line to support its claims about its effect on infrastructure development in Maryland for electric vehicles.
I'm sorry, was that a statement or was that a question?
This is a question. Correct. Correct. Sorry. It's just a clarifying question.
Okay, we have not done any analysis on the impact of this rebuilt transmission line on the ability to have electrical vehicles connected to the system. That is correct.
Mr. Hozempa, the company has noted that Maryland has very aggressive goals for the adoption of electric vehicles. Would you agree that if the Doubs-Goose Creek line were to be retired, the state would still be able to pursue its electric vehicle goals?
Objection.
Sustained.
Mr. Hozempa, is it correct to state that this line has no unique impact or effect on the state's efforts to increase electric vehicle usage?
In my opinion, and of course I don't know all the factors that go into making those decisions at the state level, but I would doubt that one of the factors that the state considered was whether or not the Doubs-Goose Creek line was in service. I don't think that weighed into their decision at all.
Thank you, Mr. Hozempa. Now, Mr. Hozempa, I'd like to return to your response, the company's response in OPC DR 1-5. And at the response to question 1-5E, the company further states that any renewable generation project currently in the PJM interconnection queue could potentially benefit.
Mr. San Martino, could you just wait for the sirens to pass?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, thanks.
That's the whole fleet. So in this response to OPC DR 1-5E, where the company states any renewable generation projects currently in the PJM interconnection queue could potentially benefit from the Doubs-Goose Creek line. Is it also correct that any project in the interconnection queue would similarly benefit from any 500 kV tie line constructed in the PJM footprint, not just from the Doubs-Goose Creek line?
Yes, that is correct, but it doesn't even have to necessarily be a tie line. A 500 kV line, whether it's a tie line or not, would provide deliverability benefit to any generation in the PJM system.
And in the company's response to OPC DR 1-5A, where the company states that any renewable generation or distributed energy resource connected within the eastern interconnection is served by the Doubs-Goose Creek 500 kV line. Is it also correct that any such resource connected within the eastern interconnection is served by any 500 kV line in the eastern interconnection?
Yes, and again, that goes into the premise that I stated before, is all this generation just feeds into the system, and that power moves around the system. The electrons flow where they will, and as you do the analysis, you can find situations on the system where generation in some part of the system is using a transmission line in a different part of the system to deliver its energy.
So, is it the company's position then that any 500 kilovolt line constructed in Maryland will protect the global climate and help achieve the state's greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals, regardless of where it's located?
Objection.
What's your basis, ma'am?
I don't think that this witness is able to answer that question. I mean, he can certainly
Yeah, I
try,
think
but
it-
it doesn't,
I
it
think
seems
it-
to be straying from his testimony.
I think it calls for an incredible amount of speculation as if he could testify as to transmission lines on the eastern shore or anything outside of Potomac Edison.
I'll try a different way, Your
Okay,
Honor.
please.
Mr. Hozempa, is it the company's position that any 500 kilovolt line constructed within Potomac Edison's service territory in Maryland will protect the global climate and help achieve the state's greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals?
Yeah, and I think, again, going back to my supplemental direct testimony where I was referring to those studies that were done by those various research firms that look into these things, that additional transmission capacity will help the country as a whole achieve its renewable resource targets, because transmission capacity is needed to make sure that we have a reliable system that can deliver renewable energy to load.
Thank you, Mr. Hozempa. So I have a DR response. It's the company's response to PPRP DR 9-4, which you sponsored. Your Honor, I'd like to have this DR response marked as OPC Exhibit 10.
It'll be so marked for identification.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I approach?
You may. Just out of curiosity, Mr. San Martino, how much more do you have? And I don't want to rush you. I'm just trying to get an idea.
Hopefully no more than 20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay.
But I'm happy if people...
No, I just want to make sure, I'd like to finish Mr. Hozempa before we take a break. Are you doing okay, sir?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Hozempa, do you recognize what has been marked as OPC Exhibit 10?
Yes,
And you sponsored the answer to this DR, correct?
that is correct.
Do you have any corrections to make to your response?
No, I do not.
So your response remains accurate as of today's date?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd like to have OPC Exhibit 10 moved into
All right.
evidence.
Any objections?
No
No, Your
objection.
Honor.
10's admitted.
Mr. Hozempa, in the company's response to PPRP DR 9-4B, the company states that Potomac Edison does not have any specific studies or white papers to support the statement that this line can be used to deliver renewable energy. Is that still correct?
Yes, that is correct. We don't have any studies specifically about this line in relation to that topic.
And then is it also correct that the company didn't conduct any studies or commission any white papers to support its claims about the line's claimed climate benefits?
That is correct.
Now, Mr. Hosep, I'd like to ask just a few more questions about the company's decision to propose this project as a supplemental project through the attachment M3 process in PJM. And I have here a data response. It's OPC DR4-1, which you sponsored. Your Honor, I'd like to have this DR marked as OPC Exhibit 11.
It'll be 11 for identification.
May I approach?
You may. Thank you.
Mr. Hozempa, do you recognize what has been marked as OPC Exhibit 11?
Yes, I do.
And you sponsored the answer to this DR, correct?
That is correct.
Do you have any corrections to make to your response?
I do not.
And so your response remains accurate as of today's date, correct?
I would like to review the response to staff 9-3 before I answer that question.
Sure. May I approach?
Certainly.
Thank you.
Mr. Hozempa, Mr. Hozempa, does your response to OPC DR 4-1 remain accurate as of today's date?
Yes, it does.
Your Honor,
Objection, that,
4-1.
I'm sorry, but
This
I'm
is-
looking at staff 9-3. Mr. Souter sponsored that response.
Yes, he did.
Ms. Leone, I'm asking about OPC 4-1, which
It refers to staff 9-3, which is OPC Exhibit 2. Is that, we all on the same page? Is it,
yes.
okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I just wanted to clarify that if you're asking questions about 9-3, that he's not the sponsor, as opposed to being the sponsor of 4-1 for OPC.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Your Honor, I'd like to have OPC 4-1, which is marked as OPC Exhibit 11, moved into evidence.
Any objections?
No objection.
All right, 11's admitted.
Mr. Hozempa, do you agree with Mr. Suter's responses in his DR, in DR 9-3?
Yes, I do.
And so you'd agree that a FERC Form 715 project is included in the RTEP and is a project in which the company is identified as reaching its end-of-life criteria, correct?
If the transmission owner filed end-of-life criteria in their FERC Form number 715 with the Commission, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, if they filed that as one of their criteria, then yes, that would be a baseline project. But as Mr. Souter stated earlier today, only Dominion has an end-of-life criteria in their FERC Form number 715.
And you'd agree that for a supplemental project, those projects are not needed to comply with PJM reliability, operational performance, FERC Form 715, or economic criteria. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So then, by definition, the Doubs-Goose Creek line, that's a supplemental project, is not needed to comply with PJM reliability, operational performance, FERC Form 715, or economic criteria, correct?
That is correct. On the Potomac Edison side, it is necessary on the Dominion side to apply or to meet the FERC Form number 715 criteria in Dominion.
Mr. Hozempa, so I have OPC's response, the company's response to OPC DR 4-2, which you sponsored. Your Honor, I'd like this marked as OPC Exhibit 12.
It'll be OPC 12 for identification.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes, sir. Thanks.
Mr. Hozempa, do you recognize what has been marked as OPC Exhibit 12?
Yes,
And you sponsored the answer to this DR, correct?
that is correct.
Do you have any corrections to make to your response?
I do not.
So your response remains accurate as of today's date?
That is correct.
Your Honor, I'd like to have OPC Exhibit 12 moved into evidence.
Any objections?
No objection.
12's admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Hozempa, the company's response to OPC 4-2A states that the company administers end-of-life projects through its own end-of-life methodologies. And in 4-2C, the company lists 3 projects included in the RTEP as Form 715 projects, one of which was an end-of-life project. Do you agree that if the Doubs-Goose Creek line satisfies the company's end-of-life criteria, it would be eligible for inclusion as a baseline reliability project in the RTEP as a Form 715 project?
No, because there's no end-of-life criteria in our FERC form number 715. So it would not be a baseline project.
Is it correct that the company has the option to propose the Doubs-Goose Creek line for inclusion in the RTEP as a baseline project through Form 715?
If we were to change our FERC form number 715 to include an end-of-life criteria, then yes, that would become a baseline project.
Mr. Hozempa, if you could help me understand something. In the response to 4-2C, subletter A, this was a project that the company identified as an end-of-life project and was included in the RTEP as a Form 715 project. So I'm a little bit confused, and maybe if you could help clarify how this project wound up in the RTEP through Form 715, but the Doubs-Goose Creek project could not be proposed and included in the RTEP through Form 715.
Okay, this Mount Storm to Doubs transmission line, and many of you may be familiar with the criticality of that particular 500 kV line to the reliability of the eastern part of PJM. So Dominion had an end-of-life criteria for their 98 miles of that line that indicated they needed to rebuild their portion of the line. The reliability of that line was critical from a system perspective to be completed as a rebuild project, just because without that line in service, the system is in a very dire condition. Just put it that way for now. So PJM elected to assign Potomac Edison a baseline project for their portion of the line, which was 2.7 miles. But it was not based on a criteria that Potomac Edison had for end of life. It was based on PJM's perspective that the criticality of that line was so high that they wanted to assign a baseline project to rebuild the line in its entirety, not just the 98 miles that was in Dominion's footprint, but then also the little bit of line that was in the Potomac Edison footprint.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hozempa. Your Honor, I have no further questions for this witness.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Dean?
Staff has no questions for this witness. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Leone?
If we could have just a moment.
Certainly.
Your Honor, my co-counsel is requesting 2 minutes to talk with our expert.
All right.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Let's, why don't we just take 10 minutes? Okay, we'll be back at 2.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Hozempa, just don't talk about your testimony with your counsel, okay?
I think I'll just stay right here and stay there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I looked at it, I didn't have anything to say right off. But I didn't answer because I wanted to think.
need to take a biology break, you absolutely should.
Speaking of, I think I'm gonna go take a biology break.
Do you guys have any more witnesses, or
Nope.
that was it, right?
Well, yeah, I mean,
Except for OPCS there.
it sounds like they're not done.
Oh, no, no. The judge still has his questions, I'm sure. Hey, Jenny, tell Bob he needs to order 10 of those 2022 editions for us,
You probably will.
because those are really useful. I think we're still using the 2016, and we've
Yeah,
cut and pasted and
changes
written
have
in.
happened.
Yeah, it'd be really good for him just to, I see their procurement officers right out beside the door here.
What do we need? Oh,
We could ask them, hey, what do,
how much did it cost?
yeah, because I think they're,
Probably not $100.
yeah, see, their PSC does it through LexisNexis, but they're very valuable to have.
Let's remember for a meeting to order.
Yeah. Take a picture with your phone.
Okay, I'm sure you do.
Yep.
But I just, okay, I'll stick around, read the file.
I can tell you didn't want to interrupt.
Hopefully we're close to.
Yep.
I don't want him to think you're taking a picture of his notes or anything, just,
Yeah, it's a very,
yeah, we'll see.
I'm hungry, but I also don't want to be here until like 5.
I know.
Very torn.
Yeah. I mean, I do think we need a lunch break or something.
There's no place around here to eat,
Place
is
to
there?
go anywhere. There's the Maryland
Pretty
Fresh, but they told us, they told Sandra and I last time they were here that there's nowhere to sit in there. There's no seating.
Last time I was at jury duty, well, A, I had an hour and 15 minutes, and B,
There used to be that cute little coffee shop right downstairs.
yeah.
Oh, Java Joe's?
Joe's.
Yeah, that was a great little place.
And there was a Starbucks across the street. It's not here anymore.
Yeah, COVID put that out.
I
There's
mean,
not much. Sandra and I,
Yeah, there's a
there's a
pot
pot
belly
belly.
around the corner.
that's where Sandra and I ended up when we started looking for places.
There's David and Dad's also, which is a little, I mean,
There's a Pita Mar, but it's a bit of a walk.
yeah.
If they give us a vote, would you, to press on and finish, or?
I don't know. I'm hungry.
I know,
We
me
need,
too.
will you bring us snacks if we press on it?
I mean, I'm sort of hitting that point where
Where you can't think anymore?
No, where I will get past it, you know what I mean? I'm at the tipping
Oh,
point where it's like,
right.
does it, you know, my stomach's growling, but it's like, no. I mean, it depends on how much more,
I don't know how much more.
I mean, I will have questions for
They'll have their witness, so it's going to take them.
yeah, and I will have questions for him, so. You're open.
Yeah, but we can have a half-hour break because there's nowhere to go. It's got to be an hour.
Yeah. Right. Well, at least pot belly would be pretty empty.
Yes, this is true. No one's going to be a pot, but we're all going to go to pot belly, which is
Exactly.
part of the problem.
Yeah.
I can go either way.
I don't care. I've missed a whole lot of lunches in my life, and it's never hurt me.
Yeah, I mean, it's been, I think we should go to the judge, obviously, too. And the other issue is that, like David
Were you
and
doing
Dad-
these hearings when Chairman Hughes was here?
Yes.
We would go till 9:30 at night. Yeah, 10 o'clock at night. Yeah. No dinner break or anything, so I always learned to bring little candies or,
My first ever case was of the, third unit at Colorado Cliffs.
oh yeah, EDF, Electricité de France.
Well, that became the issue,
That became the issue, yeah, foreign ownership.
but we did get the state permit.
Huh?
We did get the state permit, we just couldn't get the government because of
Right, right.
ownership issue.
That may be revisited, by the way.
It's going to be interesting.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, Mr. Sammartino.
Yeah, Your Honor, I just have just a couple more questions for this witness, and then I think we'll be okay.
Okay.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Mr. Hozempa, as you just stated with respect to the Mount Storm to Dobbs transmission line rebuild case, and if I understand your testimony correctly, the entire portion of that line was identified by PJM as a reliability issue and included in the RTIP as a baseline project. And PJM assigned Potomac Edison to complete its portion of that line. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Mr. Hozempa, since Dominion is in the RTEP, and as Mr. Suter testified earlier today, it seems to have been aware of that the entire line was approaching its end of life. Why didn't Potomac Edison ask about including the Doubs-Goose Creek line in the RTEP as a baseline reliability project?
We do not have an end-of-life criteria in our FERC form number 715, so we did not ask about including it as a baseline project in the RTEP.
And I just have one more question. And this refers to our discussion earlier about non-wires alternatives and market-based solutions. And are you aware of whether First Energy has a subsidiary that owns generation in the same footprint as Potomac Edison's transmission service area?
Just to let me clarify by asking the question again. You want to know if I'm aware of a subsidiary of First Energy that owns generation? Or a subsidiary of Potomac Edison that owns generation?
Subsidiary of either First Energy or Potomac Edison.
There is a subsidiary of First Energy that owns generation. I
And-
do not think there's a subsidiary of Potomac Edison that owns generation.
And just to clarify, this subsidiary of First Energy, are you aware of whether it owns generation in Potomac Edison service area?
I do not think it owns any generation resources within the Potomac Edison service territory of Maryland.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hozempa.
All right.
I have no further questions,
All
Your
right.
Honor.
Mr. Dean, I'll give you another shot.
Staff has no questions, thank you.
Okay. Ms. Leone.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Hozempa, if you could take a quick look at page 5 of your rebuttal testimony. Mr. Sammartino had asked you a number of questions that centered around some of the testimony that appears on this page. And in response, you talked about a couple of things that I want to clarify. So you first talked about the reliability enhancement methodology of Potomac Edison. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes, I do.
And as I understand it, that methodology is focused on the line in service. You were talking about ongoing testing that occurs, or just analysis, review of the line's effectiveness, reliability throughout the year. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that is correct, but if I could explain a little bit further, in our reliability enhancement methodology, there's a section in that document specifically related to condition projects for both transmission lines and transmission substations. And so within that methodology, there's a list of the different factors that are considered as they do inspections and maintenance on the equipment. So as we have like an increased maintenance cost for example, on a transformer. So we keep having transformers trip out due to some issue, and then they do testing on, they see that the dissolved gases in the oil are increasing. So then they would flag that as a potential issue that, hey, we need to look at replacing this transformer because it's getting close to failure. So we monitor all those different factors. Like transmission lines, we do semi-annual inspections on our transmission lines. Some kind of more of a cursory overview, and then other ones that are more, like pole by pole walking and structure by structure, looking at everything on the towers. So through those inspections, that's when we can determine the condition of the lines and make a determination on how much life they have left in them.
And then you also were discussing the reliability analyses that were done as a part of this process that were actually attached to your rebuttal testimony. The results of those analyses were attached to your rebuttal testimony. Do you recall discussing that?
Yes, I do.
And again, my understanding, and I'm seeking clarification here, is that those analyses were different because they focused on the line being either out of service or I think you said retired. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, because when we look at the transmission system, and again, there's thousands of transmission elements in the model, and we model each one of those. And so that total number of transmission elements we refer to as the N, just the number of elements. So it's N, that's what we start with. And then when we do our single contingency analysis, we refer to that as an N minus 1. So in other words, we take every transmission element in the model out of service one at a time, N minus 1. So that is our standard analysis we do, and as I mentioned earlier, that's what we typically do on a regular basis with all facilities in service, including this line in question, the Doubs-Goose Creek line. When we did our supplementary analysis, what we had done is we actually created a new transmission model with that line out of service. So it wasn't the same number of elements we started with in all of our traditional studies. N was different to begin with. It was now N minus 1 to start with, and then we took the additional contingencies on top of that. So everything becomes different because now you have a different starting point.
And that's how you get to the N minus 1 contingencies. Is that?
Well, that is actually part of our typical analysis, and if you look at again, I'm trying not to be too technical here. If you go to the TPL standard, they have a definition of all the different planning events that need to be studied. And N minus 1 is what's a planning event P6, where you take a transmission element out of service, adjust the system for any issues identified with that particular element out of service, and then you take a subsequent contingency. That's an N minus 1 analysis, and we do that as part of our standard testing. In this case, because we had a different N to begin with, we were already beginning N minus 1, and then we took an N minus 1 after that. It was really an N minus 3.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Let's see. Also, sort of following on from that, when you were discussing renewables and electric vehicles and the deliverability benefit, does the reliability of the line factor into that at all? So, for example, if the line were to be retired or if it didn't exist in the same way that it did in your model, would that impact the ability of renewables to be delivered into Maryland?
In my opinion, yes, because the transfer capability between Maryland and Virginia is going to be compromised without that line in service. So now, without that line, you're not going to be able to deliver any renewable, or not as much renewable energy from Virginia into Maryland, or vice versa from Maryland into Virginia. You're going to have more transmission constraints, which is what our analysis showed. When that line's out of service, we have all these other constraints, really violations, thermal overloads that show up on the system that would need to be addressed. So it's not just it's going to impact the deliverability of renewable resources, but it actually creates reliability criteria violations which still have to be addressed.
Thank you. And then if we could look at page 10 of your testimony, or I'm sorry, your rebuttal testimony, to be clear. You mentioned a few times in response to questions from Mr. Sammartino this concept of real versus reactive power needs. And in addition to that, how non-wires alternatives play into that. Could you explain a little bit more about what real versus reactive power means?
Yes, I can, and it's kind of a difficult concept for non-engineering
Attorneys?
folks.
That's why I'm asking the question.
Excuse me. The real power is what does work. So when your megawatts are the things that actually cause the lights to light, motors to turn, and so on, that's the real work that is done by electricity, is the megawatts, or the watts. Megawatt, mega just means thousands. So, or millions, sorry. On a transmission system, everything's mega or it's nothing, So, reactive power is the part of the transmission system that reactive power is necessary to make the transmission system operate. So, a real simple analogy would be if your work is to cross a river, and so you're going from one side of the river to the other in a boat. So your direct part of doing the work is getting across the river, but yet you have to fight the current. So the current would be like the reactive power. It's not really adding to the work that you're doing, but it's something you have to overcome to actually accomplish the work. In a transmission system or any power system, the reactive power is consumed by the transmission lines, the transmission transformers, and so on, and onto the distribution system. But it's just inherent in the system that there's these reactive losses. To deliver real power, you have to overcome these reactive losses in the system.
It's like resistance, essentially? Kind of, maybe?
Yeah, but from an electrical perspective, resistance would be real power.
Right, but the real power is meeting resistance from the reactive power.
Yes, there's two.
Okay,
There's the two
right,
components.
okay,
Yes.
All right, I got it, kind of.
And so then you were talking about non-wires alternatives. I'm having trouble with L's today. Non-wires alternatives, and that what they would be providing is reactive power, not real power. Did I get that right?
Non-wires alternatives could be devices that provide real power. For example, battery energy storage facilities. They can provide real and reactive power as needed.
And what about other non-wires solutions? Demand response, I think, is something that you mentioned in your testimony, and obviously behind the meter generation.
Yeah, demand response is not creating megawatts, it's actually reducing megawatts on the system. So you get a number of people or companies or businesses to agree to cut their demand or their use of energy under certain system conditions, so you free up megawatts on the system for others to use. That's demand response. Behind the meter generation is something that's mostly handled on the distribution system, where you have residential customers or businesses installing solar panels or battery energy storage that they're using to reduce their energy usage, that can also be used to, again, supplant megawatts on the system or watts on the system.
Thank you. And then just one final question. You were talking about the Mount Storm Doubs line, and I note here in OPC 12, the response to Part C, Subpart A, which states that the Maryland PSC awarded a CPCN for the Mount Storm Doubs project on June 4th, 2013. To your knowledge, is there any difference in the current baseline RTAP process with respect to competitive windows and all of the things that go along with a baseline project? That has it been the same since 2013, or has it changed?
No, there has been a lot of changes in the PJM process due to FERC orders that have come out, including FERC Order 1000 and FERC Order 869, that have made a big change in the way PJM operates the regional transmission organization when it comes to not only baseline projects but supplemental projects and the transparency issues and so on. So the attachment M3 process is one of the ones that was developed out of that change in the managing of the transmission organization to make sure that as transmission companies came up with these supplemental projects, that stakeholders would have a chance to be part of that process. It would be transparent as to what criteria the company was using, what the specific need was, and what the solution would be, so stakeholders could comment on it. And the FERC Order 1000, of course, was to open up, baseline transmission projects to the competitive process, which didn't exist at that time.
So, to be clear, in 2013, when the Mount Storm Doubs project was being evaluated, that competitive process wasn't in place.
That's correct.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
All right.
Mrs. Witness, you're
Thank you, ma'am. All right. I do have a few. A lot of them have been asked already. Hopefully these will be relatively easy. There's a couple statutory provisions that deal with the PJM operating agreements for the operation and maintenance of the line. Can you discuss those a little bit, sir? The
Yeah.
ones that are applicable?
Yeah, when a transmission owning entity joins PJM, they have to sign the applicable agreements to participate in the PJM system, which is basically given PJM functional control of their transmission assets, and then also the transmission owner would be bound by those agreements. So if PJM identified reliability constraints on their system, that the transmission owner would then do the necessary upgrades as required by PJM to meet their specific reliability needs. So those are really based on the RTEP baseline type projects. The supplemental project process is in the PJM tariff, attachment M3, which then also governs how transmission owners would move their supplemental projects through the PJM process.
Okay. Is it fair to say that Potomac Edison will comply with the respective PJM operating agreements?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Next one. What types of obligations are imposed by NERC and FERC on the operation and maintenance of the line, sir? If you know.
Well, I know FERC has given NERC the authority to assess the reliability or impose reliability standards on the transmission entities within the United States. So we have to adhere to those standards. There's a lot of accounting things that go along with FERC jurisdiction that I'm not really well aware of, so I can't answer anything about that. On the NERC side, with the reliability standards and the other standards that they have, we have to adhere to their standards. There's different standards for entities like PJM, which are regional transmission organizations and transmission operators, and there's other standards that apply to transmission owners and other standards that apply to generation owners. We, as a transmission owning company or a transmission owner, we adhere to all the standards that are applicable to us from NERC.
Okay. All right. And obviously, you'll continue to do so with respect to this project, assuming it's granted.
Because FERC can impose fines if we don't apply, or if we don't meet their standards up to $1 million a day, I believe.
Okay. All right. Thank you, sir. On page 8 of your rebuttal, line 7, you state, on this project, Potomac Edison has elected to use Dominion standard 500 kV design. Why was that agreed to? Why not use Potomac Edison's design?
We felt at the time that we were actually working through this, because our original design was Potomac Edison's standard design. And then we modified that as the project was progressing, because we felt that we could actually contract with Dominion to utilize their tower design series and their basically overall tower design and conductor design and accomplish a more cost-effective construction than we could with our design.
Okay. And is it I assume you did some kind of analysis that showed what the design or what the cost would have been had you used PE's design versus Dominion's? Is that fair to say?
I would think we did. I'm not sure exactly the detail that went into that, but it was some analysis was done to determine that was the better way to go.
Okay. And how much different is Potomac Edison's standards or their design standards?
Not significantly different. We use a different conductor and a different tower design, but overall, we feel very confident that Dominion, who's rebuilt a lot of their 500 kV system because they invested heavily in the Core 10 lattice tower designs when they were building out their 500 kV system, so they've replaced a lot of their 500 kV. This, we feel very confident that their design will meet all of our needs, and the system needs it as well.
And the use of Dominion's design is essentially what's doubling the capacity.
Well, actually, if we were to use the Potomac Edison design, Dominion's design would be limiting the capacity compared to our design.
Okay, so it would have been even higher.
Well, no.
No.
Because Dominion would still have their portion,
Right.
which would still be their design. So because there's a process to coordinate the rating of tie lines in the interconnection, even though we'd have a different rating for the line on the Potomac Edison side, Dominion's rating would be lower than ours, and the lower rating would prevail.
Okay. All right. On page 8, you also reference Dominion's approval of their portion of the line in Virginia. I mean, what relevance does that have to this proceeding?
In my opinion, because the Virginia State Corporation Commission found that there was a need to rebuild this line and maintain its serviceability, that would weigh into this proceeding as well, that another state has already looked at it and determined that there's a need for this facility.
Do you know what factors Virginia looks at versus Maryland?
I think they look at the same factors. I think they look at what's the driver for the need to rebuild the line, which in this case is condition, and they also look at, is the line serving a reliability need? And the Virginia State Corporation Commission in their order clearly stated that there is a reliability need for this line.
Okay. On the next page, sir, you talk about the data center growth in Dominion. Do you have any update or know what the status of that, when it's expected to come online? If you know.
Yes, I do. Actually, it's quite significant load growth, and it's probably a term that maybe doesn't carry the same weight because it's kind of overused, is unprecedented. But the growth that Dominion is seeing in their footprint, particularly around Data Center Alley and a little bit further to the south, it is unprecedented, the amount of growth they're seeing. So the Dominion load in their footprint is somewhere around 20,000 megawatts or a little bit more than that. And they're expecting to add 9 or 10,000 megawatts in the next 5 to 8 years. So that's a 50% load growth in a very short time. And from Potomac Edison perspective, we're just starting to get into some of this data center because we have a facility, the Quantum Loophole facility, which you may have heard of, and we're dealing with them, which is a data center project. And the growth projections that they've told us are above and beyond anything we've had to deal with in the past. So we're kind of leaning on Dominion's expertise to understand what we may expect. Because in Dominion right now, they have determined that they can't meet all their customer demands and are actually telling customers, hey, you're going to have to wait for 5 years until we build some more infrastructure, which is a position I don't want Potomac Edison to be in.
Right. And in terms of the amount of load that is used, I guess, by the data center by this line, I know you had thrown out 10% as an example. Is it fair to say that, kind of like the renewables, you don't know exactly how much capacity from the line will be used by the data center?
That is correct. I don't really know exactly what that value will be, but I can give you a little bit of background on how I determined that number.
Sure.
Because if you look where Data Center Alley is, which is right near Dulles Airport, there's 2 500 kV lines that come up from the south in the Dominion footprint, and then there's this one 500 kV line that comes from the north. So assuming that load is in that same area, we could split that 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, that each 500 kV line would serve 1/3 of that. But Dominion does have a robust 230 kV network, and I'm not sure all that 9,000 megawatts is going to be right in that congested pocket. Some of it may move further south. So I kind of took a conservative approach and said, hey, we're going to serve about 10% of that load. I mean, I could have said 30% and still felt comfortable with that number, but I thought 10% was reasonable in being conservative. So you add another 900 megawatts to what we already see on that line. That's a significant amount of flow.
Okay. All right. I think that's all I have on that. On page 11 and 12 of your rebuttal, you provide a definition of critical electricity infrastructure, and you say what it is. Is there an entity that makes the determination that this is CEI, or is it up to the utility, or the transmission owner, I should say?
I don't know if there's actually an entity that does that. We make a determination internally about that.
Okay, because it looks like, I mean, the definition's pretty broad. Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay. And I know you'd cited public health service, 911 communications, hospitals. Would, in theory, those would be impacted by the loss of any transmission line, correct?
That is correct, and we
Okay.
believe all of our transmission assets are critical energy infrastructure.
Okay, so I think that answers my next question. And in terms of the national security aspect of it, is it purely based on the line's location near DC and Northern Virginia and all the federal and military installations, not necessarily based on anything like, you're hooking up to the Pentagon, for example?
That is correct. It's in that vicinity, but throughout our service territory, we serve a number of government entities, FBI, other military bases, and so on. So we serve a lot of what I would call critical facilities from a national perspective.
Almost done. So would you also say that this project serves as, there's a public safety aspect of this? That's also one of the provisions in 2113 that the commission needs to consider.
I would say yes, because again, if you're losing, reliable transmission service and is impacting things like emergency responders or hospitals or anything like that, then yeah, there's a public safety aspect to it.
All right. Finally, the Mount Storm project. So in that case, PJM told Potomac Edison, you're treating this as a baseline project. Is that fair to say?
Yes, because we could have elected as Potomac Edison to say, well, we're not going to rebuild our portion because we don't have a criteria for that, but PJM felt that the entire line needed to be rebuilt because of the criticality of that transmission line.
Right, but could Potomac Edison have said, no, we're going to do it as a supplemental project?
We could have.
Okay. Okay, so you
But
could have.
One of the differences, a supplemental project, the cost for a supplemental project is all allocated to the transmission zone in which that project takes place. So in that case, we would have allocated all the cost to that rebuild to the Allegheny zone, which is how PJM defines that zone which Potomac Edison is in. Whereas when they made it a baseline, now it falls under the cost allocation procedure for baseline projects, which is for 500 kV facilities, it's 50% based on the load share ratio and then 50% based on the DFACs,
Okay.
which distribution factors, basically who's using that facility.
All right, so, and I guess it would have been cheaper doing it through the baseline in terms of cost allocation?
From a cost allocation perspective, that's correct.
All right. All right, thank you. All right, any questions based on mine, Ms. Leone?
No, Your Honor.
No, Your
Sure.
Honor.
No, Your Honor.
Thank you very much for your time, sir. I appreciate it. All right. Are you out of witnesses, Ms. Leone?
I am out of witnesses,
Okay.
Your Honor.
All right. Okay, it's 2:04. What do folks want to do?
Press on.
Is that a press on? Yes, sir. Mr. Alexander.
Half an hour lunch.
Okay. All right. Is half an hour okay for everyone? Again, full intent on finishing today. All right. All right, so we'll be back at 2:35.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Your Honor. All right. Anything that is,
This is safe here.
I think it's probably safe here. I mean,
I got a cold, so. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's all right. Thank you.
Duncan is by the pop.
Yeah, you go to Pop.
see you and, yeah, and I hope your husband like you. Okay, that's good. And a happy and healthy new year. You and your kids and grand.
I've skipped 1,000 lunches in my life and it hasn't hurt me.
I feel the same way.
Yeah, I haven't lost any weight. So, yeah.
Yep, same with me. I started out in college. Eat once a day, you get better.
It's been a long time. Not eating was part of the deal, yeah.
No one keeps put it under my sleeve, so no.
Or being forced to eat whenever they told you.
And whatever they give you.
So are these data centers, is that the cloud?
Yeah, but then we have to go up and down.
Yes.
They store stuff. It's just, are they just giant banks of computers? They don't make many jobs though, do they?
Yes. Well,
No, the one, the Quantum one.
Oh, you have it.
Oh, really?
Taken care of.
depending on the size of the facility, because they have people there that are in their sales force, they could be selling their capacity. They also have people to maintain from
A lot of AC.
a lot of AC, because they pack, like the blade servers, they pack those all into the building, and they generate a lot of heat. So then they need to make sure that they keep
Cool. It's mostly cooling, not much heating.
Yeah, right.
I worked on the paper for.
Gary, I'm going to scoot upstairs real quick.
And I saw, as I read through the materials, it generates, it was a good number of jobs. I know. What is it?
Well, we actually went down, Andrew and I went down to Dominion, and we wanted to tour there, and see the data center alley, and just, there's these huge nondescript buildings, nothing fancy about them, and they just fill them with computers, and that's what they do.
I've seen those out by Riverside, California. Enormous buildings. Of course, I've also seen a couple hundred wind towers just south of that. They have a lot of wind out there.
Yeah, Dominion said that the big demand right now is cloud computing. That's what's driving this growth, because a lot of more companies, instead of buying their own computer power, are just using the cloud to do all the calculations.
Microsoft worked it, and now all the others.
She would never hear about it or something. And she would never hear any mention of that.
No, it went just
I
fine.
know Bob texted us.
head out, guys.
He was talking about lunch.
Get back.
Well,
I thought they muted those during the breaks.
Should have. I think if you're discreet, you can do whatever you want. I think Robin's something about the tax through the hunger.
I think I do too.
Have a nice dinner. Can't they mute the YouTube?
Oh, I should call Bill.
That's not up to me.
What is that? This is weird.
She was gonna call me PO issues, and I doubt it's you guys. No, you guys are pretty straightforward. I have some universities. They're always, the universities are always. No Duncan? No Duncan. No DoorDash.
That's what we need, yeah. We should still have to eat it downstairs. How far away are you from here?
My home. My home.
Yeah.
Like hour, at least an hour and a half, hour and 40 minutes.
Not that far.
It's not awful, but.
So you had some questions? Excuse me.
Oh, no, I'm just always curious about, sorry, I'm just,
experience,